south of Pokrovsk. I'm quite concerned about those Russian gains. But I think what's been lost in all of this is, yes, the Russians have seized these fields and this territory, and on the map it looks quite big, but none of this is strategic territory. And actually, the achievement of blunting a major Russian offensive and denying the Russians their preferred objective for this season is actually a successive defense. Yes, the Ukrainians have lost ground in other places, but for a prepared pitch battle where the Ukrainians could anticipate the main Russian effort and blunt it, that's good.
What do you read into Russia's operations around Pokrovsk in particular?
Sure. So what it tells us is we can learn a little bit about the Russian operational art and how the Russian command staff and their theater commanders are learning. So the Russian stated objective for their fall campaign cycle in 2024 was the seizure of Pokrovsk. They got Avdiivka back in April. Since then, they've been driving to Pokrovsk, and that was their explicit objective. The Russians, however, have since then hit very stiff resistance on the immediate outskirts of Pokrovsk. They managed to seize many of the fields and the villages. They advanced about 30 kilometers from Avdiivka up to the vicinity of Pokrovsk, but since then, they have not been able to advance. And starting in the fall, the Russian command actually stopped conducting these sort of headbutt frontal assaults directly into Pokrovsk, but then they started to attack the flanks south of Pokrovsk and expand their penetration, expand their salient. And what the Russian command was doing was they were finding opportunities by looking for these weak spots in the Ukrainian line. They exploited Ukrainian unit rotations, they found weak spots in the line, and they reinforced it. And the way I like to think about the Russian military here is they sort of think like water. Sort of like how water tries to find the path of least resistance when it's thrown on a bunch of rocks or something. When it hits a hard object, sometimes they just slog through. But in this case, they actually decided to not slog through, and they decided to find other paths through which they could develop some advances as well. And the Russians have advanced. They found some weak spots in the line, and they have seized more territory south of Pokrovsk. And we actually just last night on November 24th, published a new piece that forecasted what the Russians might be attempting to do in that territory south of Pokrovsk. I'm quite concerned about those Russian gains. But I think what's been lost in all of this is, yes, the Russians have seized these fields and this territory, and on the map it looks quite big, but none of this is strategic territory. And actually, the achievement of blunting a major Russian offensive and denying the Russians their preferred objective for this season is actually a successive defense. Yes, the Ukrainians have lost ground in other places, but for a prepared pitch battle where the Ukrainians could anticipate the main Russian effort and blunt it, that's good. Now let's talk a little bit about south of Pokrovsk, if I might. So the Russians seized Vuhledar, which is an operationally significant town, on October 1st, and the Russians have succeeded in leveraging their tactical gains in Vuhledar to be able to further advance in that sort of southeasternmost corner of the theater, if you're looking at the map. The Russians are currently advancing north of Vuhledar. They created a pocket, a salient near a town called Karakovoy next to a large reservoir, and they're currently trying to collapse the flanks and envelop that pocket. And then the Russians are also trying to attack the easternmost flank of a town called Velika Novosilka, which is operationally significant, which is a Ukrainian strong point. These Russian gains are quite concerning because the Russians are actually now just under 10 kilometers from the border between Donetsk Oblast, Zaporizhia Oblast, and Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. And if the Russians wanted, if they're not able to get to Pokrovsk through the direct frontal assault, then what they might decide to do is attack the rear and envelop the Ukrainian positions and try to intersect the key highways that actually run to and support the Ukrainian positions near Pokrovsk. I know a lot of this sounds abstract, so you might maybe, the listeners could look at a map while I'm talking about this. And there are some weaknesses and vulnerabilities in the Ukrainian line the Russians are exploiting. And they're making some relatively rapid advances for this war, but in the grand scheme of what is normal in mechanized warfare, still quite slow and quite attritional. I'd also note that the Russians seem to be getting better at waging more complex operations. So what we see now operating in this sort of Pokrovsk, Karakovoy, Vuhledar, Velika Novosilka corner of the theater is we see elements of at least three different major Russian groups of forces. from the Central Military District, the Southern Military District, and the Eastern Military District, all operating here. That's a big deal. Historically, the Russians do not have, historically, they've not been successful at having multiple elements of different large formations and groups of forces be able to work out the interoperability to effectively converge on a single area and conduct those combined operations before. What we're seeing now is a more complex cast of characters involved in the operation, Russian gains to boast for it, and if the Russians are successful in the coming months of continuing the momentum that they're building right now, then that would indicate that the Russian command is actually learning some lessons, becoming more effective, and restoring some of the principles of the great venerated Soviet doctrine and the operational art that the Russian Federation seemed to have forgotten and not successfully executed for all of this war. So a lot of eyes are happening right now and pointed at that southern part of Donetsk Oblast and trying to see, all right, the Russians were not prepared to have an opening here in the south. They were trying to go for Pokrovsk, but they now have found themselves with an opening here. They did not prepare for it necessarily. How far will they be able to take it? And that's the sort of the open research question that we have now. So yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
We know about the North Korean troops fighting on the side of Russia, but the fact that they're now going to Yemen, trying to recruit from the Houthi fighters there, I mean, how fraught with risk is that for Vladimir Putin, both in terms of the fact that it speaks to his underlying weakness when it comes to manpower, but also in terms of, you have an incoming Trump administration who some argue may be more sympathetic towards Vladimir Putin, but they would not necessarily be sympathetic to anyone who is buddying up with Iran, which Russia have been, and with the Houthis in Yemen. So does it speak to Putin's weakness, and what risks are there attached to that?
Sure. Well, it's to be determined exactly the scale and size of the recruitment. So the Financial Times just yesterday broke a story that the Houthis have been the fixers for the Kremlin, and they've been apparently involved in helping recruit several hundred Yemeni men. The FT report described the majority of them as not having previous fighting experience to go fight in Russia, and that's fine. The Russians have developed a concept of operations where they can take untrained personnel, like prisoners that were languishing in jail for a long time, or criminals, or other people, and just send them to the front lines and mass meat assaults, and you can make some tactical gains that way. The current Russian warfare can use essentially poorly trained, not very capable infantry to make some gains on the battlefield. I think it depends entirely on the scale and size of what they can get from the Yemenis, but it's not just the Yemenis. I would be inclined to look at all of these alternative force generation pipelines as the system by which the Russians are trying to offset their current operational monthly losses. So, for example, if between the North Koreans, the Yemenis, I believe we've got Cubans fighting in Russia for the Russians as well, right? All of these little things, a couple hundred here, a couple thousand there, those add up. And if, for example, the Russians can pull in 10,000 foreign fighters from a variety of different countries per month, then that basically offsets 1/3 of their monthly casualty rate, which is not a bad offset. So that's what that is about. Regarding the policy and the politics of it all, look, it's unfortunate that Iran and Iran's larger proxy network throughout the Middle East are becoming increasingly involved in the war in Ukraine, because they do grant the Russians important capabilities. Thankfully for people such as myself, they help us make the argument that you cannot be an Iran hawk and a Russia dove. These are incompatible positions. And in fact, when you see the North Koreans and the Chinese and the Iranians increasingly supporting and working with the Russians in exchange for other capabilities the Russians are giving these states, you now actually have to realize that this is actually resembling more of an axis of hostile authoritarian states. And in order to effectively deal with these adversaries, you actually have to treat them all as adversaries. And so, with the Iran's deepening engagement and now the Houthis becoming fixers for force generation, it helps us make the case that, look, if we're going to be serious about being tough on China and Iran, then you also have to be tough on Russia too.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.